In the heart of Venice, a city where canals shimmered like liquid mirrors, lived a noble merchant named Antonio. Antonio was more than just a merchant. He was the beating heart of the city, known for his generosity and kind nature. His ships sailed the seas, bringing back riches that he would generously distribute among the needy. His constant smile warmed the hearts of all who knew him. In a darker corner of the city lived Shylock, a Jewish moneylender notorious for his greed and cruelty. Shylock was a controversial figure, viewed by some as the embodiment of evil and by others as a victim of societal prejudice. He harbored a particular hatred for Christians, especially Antonio, whom he blamed for the mistreatment of Jews. One day, Antonio's dear friend Bassanio approached him with a plea. Bassanio was deeply in love with a noblewoman named Portia, but there was a catch to winning her hand. He had to choose the correct casket from 3, each adorned with a different symbol. Antonio was eager to help his friend, but his wealth was tied up in his merchant ships, which were currently at sea. Desperate, he turned to Shylock, who offered him a loan on one condition. If Antonio failed to repay the loan by a certain date, Shylock would be entitled to a pound of Antonio's flesh. Reluctantly, Antonio agreed to Shylock's terms, trusting that his friend would be able to repay the loan. However, fate had other plans. After agreeing to the Faustian bargain, Bassanio set sail for Venice, his heart filled with hope and dreams. Upon arriving in the bustling city, he wandered its narrow streets and bustling markets. He arrived at Portia's palace and found himself before 3 golden caskets, each adorned with an enigmatic inscription. The first casket bore the image of an old man, the second a handsome young man, and the third a weeping child. Bassanio hesitated, unsure of which casket to choose. Remembering Antonio's advice to follow his heart, Bassanio chose the casket with the image of the young man, believing it symbolized hope and youth. Unfortunately, he had chosen incorrectly. Inside the casket, he found a skull and a message informing him that he had chosen wisely, but not nobly. Overwhelmed by disappointment, Bassanio returned to Antonio, his heart heavy. Meanwhile, Antonio was consumed by worry. He feared Shylock would enforce their terrible bargain. Despite his efforts, he was unable to repay the debt. As the deadline approached, Antonio despaired, wishing he had never agreed to Shylock's terms. As Antonio awaited news of his ships, a terrible storm raged across the seas. The violent winds and towering waves battered his fleet, and one by one, his vessels sank beneath the unforgiving waves. All of Antonio's wealth was lost at sea. Word of the shipwreck reached Venice, and Antonio was devastated. With his fortune ruined, he was now at the mercy of Shylock. Bassanio, filled with guilt and despair, realized the gravity of his actions. Meanwhile, Shylock reveled in Antonio's misfortune. The time had come for him to collect his pound of flesh. The entire city of Venice buzzed with the news of Antonio's predicament and Shylock's impending revenge. Portia, upon hearing of Antonio's plight, was filled with a deep sense of sorrow. She knew she had to do something to save her husband's friend. With the help of her clever maid Nerissa, she devised a plan. Disguised as a young male lawyer, Portia set off for Venice, determined to save Antonio from Shylock's clutches. As Antonio learned of the loss of his ships and Bassanio's failed attempt to win Portia's hand, the day of reckoning drew near. Shylock, eager for his revenge, prepared to claim his pound of flesh. The trial began in a tense atmosphere. Antonio sat pale and defeated, his fate sealed. Shylock stood confidently, demanding his due. He recited the terms of the bond aloud, emphasizing every clause. A crowd gathered in the courtroom, watching with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Bassanio and Portia watched helplessly from the sidelines. The judge, a wise and just man, tried to persuade Shylock to show mercy and accept a larger sum of money. But Shylock was determined, insisting on exacting his pound of flesh. Meanwhile, Portia watched from afar, devising a plan to save Antonio. She knew time was running out and she had to act quickly. The courtroom was tense as Antonio awaited his fate. Shylock, confident and unrelenting, demanded his pound of flesh. But just as hope seemed to dwindle, a figure dressed in a lawyer's robe entered the courtroom. It was Portia, disguised to save Antonio. With a calm and collected voice, Portia addressed the court. She expertly dissected the bond, pointing out a legal loophole. She argued that while the bond stipulated a pound of flesh, it did not mention any blood. Therefore, if Shylock took a pound of flesh without spilling any blood, he would be breaking the law. Shylock, caught off guard by Portia's clever argument, was momentarily confused. He realized that if he followed the bond to the letter, he risked committing a crime. Reluctantly, he agreed to Portia's terms. The judge ordered a scale and a sharp knife to be brought into the courtroom. Shylock stood beside Antonio, ready to claim his prize. But as he raised the knife, Portia intervened once more. She argued that as a foreigner, Shylock was forbidden from carrying a weapon in Venice. Therefore, his attempt to take Antonio's life was a crime punishable by law. The judge ruled in favor of Portia. Shylock was stripped of half his wealth, forced to convert to Christianity, and banished from Venice. Antonio was saved, and Portia's quick thinking and legal knowledge had triumphed. After the dramatic courtroom showdown, the judge delivered his verdict. Shylock, expecting victory, was met with a crushing defeat. He was ordered to forfeit half his wealth to the state and forced to convert to Christianity. Antonio, thanks to Portia's wisdom and courage, was spared from a terrible fate. Portia left the courtroom feeling a sense of triumph and relief. She had saved her husband's friend and proven herself to be a woman of great intelligence and courage. Yet she knew this was not the end of the story. Shylock, once so proud and powerful, was now humiliated and broken. He had lost everything he had worked for and was forced to abandon his faith. It was a just punishment for his greed and cruelty. Antonio was filled with gratitude for Portia's actions. Upon learning of her identity, he fell deeply in love with her. Antonio, Bassanio, and Portia became close friends and lived happily ever after. And so, the story of the Merchant of Venice comes to an end. It is a tale that has resonated with audiences for centuries, exploring themes of justice, mercy, prejudice, and the power of love.